What's up, man? Charlie in the box. What I got in my box right here is a little bit of leftover videos from that tea party about that guy talking about the Constitution. So check out what I got here left, and I hope you guys like it.
Like I said, Declaration of Independence is a Declaration of Independence that basically freed the states from Great Britain. The people then decided to stay associated as states. Then we go into the Articles of Confederation. Once again, the people stay united as states. They agree to a limited union or confederation for a few narrow things. Takes us to the Constitution. What happens? Under the Articles of Confederation, there were certain defects, primarily commerce and the ability of the states, of the federal government, to raise sufficient revenue. So, 4 states get together at Annapolis, Maryland, and they say, we need to amend the Articles. We need to change them. That was the call for the Constitutional Convention. That's what happened. You get to the Constitutional Convention, what happens? The state of Virginia introduces a plan called the Virginia Plan. It was authored by Madison, and it was intended to annihilate the states, reduce them to geographical locations under federal control. What happens in the convention? A bunch of the small states say, screw you. We will leave. There is no way we're going to agree to this. All of the resolutions before the convention had the word national. No more federal, Union of States, national. What happens? If you go on this document to page 4, in the second paragraph, on June 6, 1787, Oliver Ellsworth, Connecticut, makes a motion to expunge the word national from the above resolutions and retain the proper title of Government of the United States. Right after that, on the 30th of June 1787, Mr. Bedford of Delaware says the small states can never agree to the Virginia Plan. He urges the convention to do what is in our power, amend and enlarge the Confederation, but not alter the federal scheme. That is exactly what happens. All this talk about the states being consolidated under one government, under federal control, under a federal thumb, is false. So, that's what this flowchart is about. That's the thrust of what this is about. Because the politicians, D.C. always tells you, federal government's supreme and above the states, and we can basically do what the hell we want. That is not true. So, in here, that pretty much is the overview for you, by date, by date, by date. So you can look at that, go through it, but that's the message. The second big lie is, again, the federal government has all this power. It can do pretty much whatever it wants to do unless the Constitution limits its powers.
And even then.
Even then. What they don't talk about, and what's rarely discussed, you've heard the separation of power between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. What's not discussed is the separation of power between the states and the federal government. Most of the things that are important about the Constitution you will never find in the document. You have to go outside the document. So, the second little 2-page handout is the separation of power between the states and the federal government. Why is this important? It's important because the separation of power comes first. The delegated powers of the federal government comes second. Those powers only pertain to powers after the separation of power took place. So, what I gave you there was, if you go to the first quote on there is the quote by Madison, who's considered the author of the Constitution. He tells you the separation of power. The next quote is a quote by John Jay, who was also one of the authors of the Federalist. He became a Supreme Court Justice. And after you read those two quotes, what you find is this. The powers of the federal government pertain to foreign affairs and relations between the states. It, over, done. That is the only constitutional powers that they have. So what has happened? What has happened is that principle has been ignored. The federal government now uses its delegated powers to encroach on the powers of the states. That's what's happening. The health care, I was asked earlier about that. You read it, they're claiming Commerce Clause. If you go into other aspects, they'll call it General Welfare Clause. Some other clause. Let me give you an example of the separation of powers. As published by the federal government in 1937, on the 150th anniversary of the Constitution being signed in the Convention. Question: where in the Constitution is there mention of education? Answer: there is none. Education is a matter reserved to the states. So what do you have? You have a massive usurpation of power. There are a lot of it. To see people do some stuff about it. The states are now starting to exercise their power and stand up to the federal government. Now, if you go back to the separation of powers thing that I talked about, that's one of the favorite things the left always does, is they try to tell you it's an outdated document for an agrarian society. They say that crap all the time. Keep in mind, the separation of powers, it makes perfect sense. It is never outdated. Foreign affairs, relations between the states, federal. Everything domestic that affects your life was state. It was supposed to stay local, like what you talked about earlier. It's not in the purview of federal power. So you've got to, before you can enforce the Constitution, you have to understand things like the separation of power.
Well, we should repeal the 17th Amendment.
That would be a great start. Now, that's a subject to something different, too. Not enough time. It's back to nullification, what I said, what you'll find in this little Constitution book on Kentucky resolutions and the Virginia resolutions in the late 1700s. Is they are proposing just basically to say it's unconstitutional, it cannot be enforced in this state. I mean, what's happening now is revolutionary. I mean, the states have the power to put the federal government back in its box that quick. That fast. They can stop all this that quick. Just by doing a few simple things. Also, on the health care plan, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier. If you read the health care plan, they cite as their constitutional authority interstate commerce. So they're using the Commerce Clause to try to get you involved in this health care plan. It's right in the document, about the first 150 pages in. And in fact, if you go on Pelosi's website, she has a whole article about that the 10th Amendment doesn't apply. And let me explain something there. Let me explain something on that. Everybody says, well, how do they get around the 10th Amendment? How do they get around that? The answer is simple. It comes back to the separation of power. Separation of power first, delegated powers of the federal government second. What are they doing?
They bought them.
Pardon?
They bought them.
Well, what they're doing is, they've skipped the separation of powers, they use the delegation of powers. The 10th Amendment only applies to powers not granted. What they do is say, oh, excuse me, but that Commerce Clause, that's a delegated power. You cannot invoke the 10th Amendment to stop us. My point is, that's why I said that this separation of powers is so important. That comes first. Federal government, foreign affairs, relations between the states. States, everything domestic that affects your life. It's crucial. It is the most crucial thing that goes on today. They could never use the delegated powers to get around the 10th Amendment if they were also arguing the separation of powers at the same time.
There was a constitutional education.
Yes. It's in between Revere, well, the windows in between Revere.